Hey YouTube, I'm back. My name's Shane and I'm a big baseball fan. Welcome to the 3 Up 3 Down channel. Today's video is a fan request, so we're going to break down and understand how Major League Baseball contracts work. We're going to follow the path of a Major League Baseball player from joining a team to progressing through the minor leagues and eventually making it to a free agency as a Major League Baseball player. If you're interested in this type of content, make sure you hit that thumbs up button down below and subscribe to the channel. As well, if you ever want to know more about baseball, leave a comment down below and I'll get to a video about it. Maybe you watched a game recently, they're talking about some stat called WAR or BABIP, or something of that nature, maybe even WOBA. I'll talk about it in a video if you comment down below. For now, we're going to follow that path of a Major League Baseball player, right from draft or signing all the way through their Major League career. So let's get into it. First step in any player's career is going to actually be making it to a Major League Baseball team's roster. And how does that happen? Well, there's three main ways that this can happen. Players can be drafted in the amateur draft. There's the international signing period. As well, players can sign as amateur free agents. So let's break down each one of those to get an understanding. First one up is one of the two big ones, and that's the MLB Amateur Draft. What is the draft exactly? Well, let's take a look. Players are eligible for the Major League Baseball's amateur draft if they are residents of the United States, Canada, or a United States territory. The best example I can give there is Puerto Rico. The player must be a high school graduate if they're not attending college, or they've completed 1 year of junior college, or they have completed the junior year, so essentially the third year, of a 4-year college, or be turning 21 years old. Now, something to keep in mind, high school students selecting the draft that do not sign with their drafted team can go to college and be selected again when eligible. So teams that are drafting high school players need to be very sure that these players are going to sign or it's going to affect them down the way. So it's a very key thing for Major League Baseball teams to know. The draft is one of the biggest things out there. So let's take a deeper look into the draft. Diving deeper into the MLB draft, we understand that it takes place each year between June 1st and July 20th. For this season, it's going to be taking place on July 17th. This year's draft is going to feature 20 rounds. This has changed over time. The COVID draft year had a much smaller draft. This year is going to feature 20 rounds. We've had drafts before go all the way up to the rounds of 60, but for right now, we're sticking with the 20 rounds. Draft picks cannot be traded, so each team makes 20 selections. Baseball is different than other sports in the fact they do not trade draft pick choices. You can trade players once they're drafted, but not the actual selections. Each team has a set amount they may spend on signing bonuses to sign draft picks. The team choosing first has the highest pool of money, and then it drops off from after that. Each draft slot has a recommended signing bonus, but players may sign for a higher or lower amount. This is a strategy that teams will use. They will draft a player understanding they're likely to sign a lower signing bonus so that they can use that money on a later pick or a different pick to sign at a higher level. Teams try to balance this out because quite often players are not signing for the exact signing bonus that is recommended for that slot. So the teams will try to manage their money as best as possible. There are penalties for teams going over their total allotment. And you should note, it's only the first 10 choices that have signed the bonus pool money. After that, things start to slow down. Should a draft pick not sign with a team, that team cannot use that bonus pool money for a different player. We saw this before with Kumar Rocker of the New York Mets last year. He was selected 10th overall by the New York Mets. He was recommended approximately $4.5 million. They expected the Mets had offered $6 million. He ended up not signing. The Mets pulled the offer because of the injury report that came out on Kumar Rocker. What happens then is they cannot use that recommended slot money to sign someone else to go over that amount. So that money essentially becomes dead space in their draft pick allotment. What happens to the team? Well, the team then gets a choice next year that's one selection lower. So Kumar Rocker was drafted at 10th overall. which means the Mets will receive a compensation pick this draft at 11th overall because of the player not signing. Players that don't sign have different options. Rocker was actually a junior, so he can go back to college for his senior year. High school players, if they're in this situation, could go to college or a junior college. If a senior in college had this happen to them, they can go and play independent ball for a year in the hopes of being drafted again the following year, or potentially signing as an undrafted free agent. So there's the basics of the MLB Amateur Draft. 20 choices. Top 10 have signing bonuses allotted to them. Teams cannot go over that amount or they're punished. The draft is a huge key for teams and is one of the two big ones we notice. So let's get into the second one right now. The second massive way for Major League Baseball teams to acquire young talent is through the international signing period. This happens every year, and there's an opportunity to sign players that are not eligible for the Major League Baseball Amateur Draft. So those will be players outside of the United States, Canada, and U.S. territories. Quite often, these are players going to be from the Dominican Republic, Venezuela, Mexico. Occasionally, you may see a player sneak in from Cuba, but that does not really happen a lot. But for right now, let's get into what are the requirements for an international signing period. The amateur signing period takes place every year from January 15th to December 15th. Who's eligible? Players who do not meet the countries of origin, as we discussed. Players must be at least 16 years old by September 1st of that year. Each team has $4.75 million to sign players to signing bonuses. Teams may trade international signing bonus slots that have an assigned value. Teams that sign free agents who have rejected qualifying offers will have their bonus pool decreased. So breaking it all down, basically each team has $4.75 million to sign international free agents. There's a point where they reach an age where they no longer qualify as an international amateur, and they would fall into a free agent category. We'll talk about that later. So overall, these are signing international young players to contracts. Typically, teams have facilities in some of these countries that once these players sign, they'll go and develop their skills further at these MLB camps. And teams can develop these talents even better and advance them to the point where they can come into the United States from true minor league baseball. To go along with international amateur signings, we also have these signings of foreign professional baseball players. So once an international player has reached a certain status within the international community, they qualify in this regard. So these are players that are 25 years or older. Now, quite often, those players that are amateur free agents who've never signed, they'll end up in these professional leagues and then will eventually qualify as foreign professional baseball players. They have to have played at least 6 seasons in a professional league recognized by Major League Baseball. We have Mexican leagues, Dominican leagues. The Japanese league is one of the biggest ones out there. Those leagues are all recognized by Major League Baseball. These players they're signing are exempt from the signing bonus money. So that $4.75 million, that's not for these types of players. They may come to MLB as true free agents. They do not have a contract with the team. Or international teams may post the player's contract, and MLB teams have to acquire the rights to an international player and then work out a contract. The posting fee would be paid to the international team. We see this quite frequently with Japanese players. If a Japanese player is on a team and has a contract with their professional team in Japan, they need to be posted. MLB teams need to bid for the rights to come up with a contract with those players and pay a fee to the team that they're currently playing for to acquire those rights. Those players then can come over to the United States and jump right into Major League Baseball. We've seen several Japanese stars come over the years through the posting system. Seiya Suzuki this year was posted. Shohei Ohtani came through the posting system, as well as former Red Sox star Daisuke Matsuzaka, who went through one of the most glamorized posting out there when he came over to the United States. So this is very key for especially Japanese players. But we've seen it as Cuban players will defect and come over as free agents as well. Sometimes we see it from the Mexican players as well, but most commonly is from the Japanese players through this system. So there's the two different ways to have both international amateur players and international foreign stars make their way into Major League Baseball. From there, of course, players from the draft, international signing, players that we're going to follow those amateur players through the minor league system and what contracts look like for them and what they eventually look like as they make it into the Major League level. So let's jump right now into what it looks like to be a minor league player in baseball. Life in the minor leagues is not as glamorous as it's made out to be. Taking a look at the pay scale for minor league players, any player that's in Class A, and now every team has a Class A low and a Class A high, those players are going to be receiving $500 a week. If you're in Class AA team, you're making $600 a week. And if you're with the AAA team, you're making $700 a week. Now note, these salaries are only paid during the season. There is no pay during spring training or the off season. So we're talking roughly 25 weeks of a minor league season. So players in the minor leagues are only making about $12,500 to about $15,000 for their entire season. That's all they're getting paid. Now, housing is now being paid during the season. This is a relatively new change, and it's costing Major League Baseball teams approximately $1 million per team per season. And when we get into later contracts and we look at what's being paid to players, $1 million cost to a Major League team for housing is basically negligible. There's such a small difference there. It's not going to affect the bottom line. Some players in the minor leagues are actually required to pay for parts of their equipment, including bats. And there are stories out there of minor league players who refuse to swing at a pitch inside because they think it's going to break their bat and they can't afford a new one. So there are these types of stories out there in the minor leagues. There's currently lawsuits taking place proceeding through the legal system over minor league pay because it's not reaching the benchmark of what's considered minimum wage. So those are progressing through the system. We're getting closer to some rulings that way. The fact is that minor league players are not being paid the salaries that really need to be being paid, considering they have to pay for their own training in the off season. They don't have the ability to hit the facilities that they normally have access to during the season. It's just not as glamorous as people make it out to be. And as you start to build further and further through the system, you're really taking that chance that you're going to make it to the majors. As a player progresses through the minor leagues, there's other key goals that they need to be reaching to establish themselves and moving closer and closer to the major leagues. First goal is that they need to be placed on the 40-man roster of the major league team. Being placed on the 40-man roster means you have the ability to be called up to the major league team. Players not on the 40-man roster cannot be brought up to the major league team. They have to be placed on that 40-man roster before that can happen. The second goal then, and this is the biggest one, is they need to get called up to the active 26-man Major League Baseball roster. This puts you in the majors, and it gives you the opportunity to start to accumulate service time, which we're going to get into in a second. Hitting that 26-man roster is huge. Now, you may be asking, well, what happens if a player doesn't reach that level and is stuck in a minor league system where a team just doesn't have the confidence to bring a player up and put them on the 40-man roster? Well, there are systems in place to avoid these types of situations, and that is the Rule 5 draft. If a player who's been signed to a team or drafted by a team is 18 or younger, in 5 years they have to be placed on the 40-man roster. If they're 19 years or older when they first join the major league roster, then they have to be on the 40-man roster within 4 years of being selected or signed. Anyone not placed in meeting those standards is placed in what's called the Rule 5 draft. The Rule 5 draft takes place every offseason at the winter meetings. So what takes place is there's a draft where the teams are drafting in order of finish, just like they would the amateur draft, where the worst team gets the first choice, etc., etc., etc. If the worst rated team, Major League Baseball, has a spot on their 40-man roster, they can select someone who has not reached the 40-man roster of another team. To understand the Rule 5 draft further, let's use an example involving the Baltimore Orioles and the New York Yankees. Let's say the Baltimore Orioles have the first choice in the Rule 5 draft, and they wish to select a player from the New York Yankees who's made available through the draft. The Orioles have to first have a spot available on their 40-man roster. If they do, they can select that player. They would then pay the Yankees a $50,000 fee for selecting that player. That player needs to remain on the Orioles' 40-man roster for the duration of the season. If at any point in time the Orioles want to remove the player from the 40-man roster, they would need to offer that player back to the New York Yankees for half the fee, so $25,000. If that happens, the Yankees can accept that, or they can decline that. If they decline it, the player becomes a free agent. Sometimes trades are worked out in these types of situations to avoid a player being lost from a team. There's how you break down the Rule 5 draft. Typically, there's not a lot of players selected through the Rule 5 draft, but there's always crucial decisions being made with prospects in particular of who to place on the 40-man roster for each team just before they get to the Rule 5 draft. So it's always an interesting time of the season for roster manipulation. Next up, let's say a player has been placed on the team's 40-man roster and they've officially made it onto the 26-man roster. They made it to the big leagues. Once a player makes it to the major leagues, there are some other key things to keep in mind with their contract. Their contract contains 3 option years. These are years where a player can be returned to the minor leagues without needing to clear waivers. After this point, another team can claim your contract. This is important because teams like to use this to move players back and forth in their option years, and option years make it very key so that they still have control over the player and can use them as required. One option is considered valid for 1 year, so there's not multiple options being used in 1 year. If a player is in the major league system and on the 26-man roster, they start to accumulate service time, and this is key to any player in the major leagues. Once there, this determines the type of contract you are eligible for based on your years of service time. So 1 day for each day in the 26-man roster or the MLB injury list, that's going to accumulate 1 day towards your service time. And 1 year of service time is considered 172 service days. This is key because as you progress through your years in the major league system, it changes the type of contract you are eligible for. First one we're looking at are pre-arbitration contracts. These are eligible to players that have less than 3 years of service time. They are often for the league minimum, which in 2022 is $700,000. This is going to go up over the next few years, but not in huge jumps. There are times where teams will pay a player more than their pre-arbitration minimum because of past performances along the way to try and entice a player and make them feel valuable to the team and try not to upset them. A pre-arbitration contract can be decreased 20% from 1 year to the next, but again, it can't go below the league minimum. And this is so uncommon, it doesn't happen a lot. The record contract for pre-arbitration was the Chicago Cubs' Chris Bryant, who was given a $1.05 million contract from the Cubs in 2017. He was on a pre-arbitration contract year before as well when he won National League MVP in 2016, was the best player in the National League, yet the following year was still only set in at $1.05 million. So pre-arbitration contracts are very important to teams at this point in time because they are essentially taking the full value of young players for cheap before they get into the bigger contracts. Once a player exceeds their 3 years of service time, we get into the next type of contract, which are arbitration contracts. Arbitration contracts take place when a player has more than 3 years of service time, but less than 6 years of service time. So essentially, players are arbitration eligible 3 times in their career. Often the team and the player come to an agreement before the arbitration process because that can kind of get ugly with teams arguing stuff out. The arbitration process has the team and player each submit a contract for the following season. A panel hears arguments and decides in favor of one side or the other. That contract amount must be tendered to the player or the player becomes a free agent. So teams still have the option, once they find out the result, they can offer that value to the player. They cannot offer anything else. Once an arbitration process has gone through, that is the value for the player set for the next season. A team can decline that value and the player becomes a free agent. The record amounts in terms of arbitration contracts typically come with agreements with the team before actually getting the arbitration process. A first-year arbitration contract award, the best with Cody Bellinger at $11.5 million with the Dodgers. The second-year record was Mookie Betts at $20 million. That's when he was with the Red Sox. And then the following year, Betts set a new record over the third-year eligible player of $27 million. That one was with the Dodgers after the trade from Boston and Los Angeles. The highest award ever from a panel was Garrett Cole's $13.9 million when he was with Houston. So there are bigger amounts becoming into play when you get arbitration contracts. Obviously, you see the records are a lot higher than the pre-arbitration deals. So this is when players really start to accumulate that value and make more and more money in their career. There is a way for a player to become arbitration eligible 4 times, and that's when they're called a Super 2. So these are players that become arbitration eligible after 2 years and not 3 years of service time. They rank in the top 22% in service time among those who have between 2 and 3 years of service time. So these are players who are almost to 3 years of service time, but not quite there, in the top 22% of those group. This is a huge manipulation taking place by teams. This is why top prospects in Major League Baseball are often start the beginning of a season in the minor leagues before being called up, often around mid-May, maybe late May or early June. This is so teams can try to avoid having them qualify as a Super 2. Because as you can see, this would guarantee a team 3 years of the player on a pre-arbitration contract and 3 years at arbitration rather than a 2 and 4 split. This is going to save the team money, and the Players Association in Major League Baseball has tried to get this out of the game, but really haven't found a way to make it work. There is some bonus pool money now available for these types of players. We'll see how that impacts decisions from teams. But for right now, teams have been leaving their prospects in the minor leagues for that so-called little bit of extra seasoning to prepare themselves for the majors, but it allows the major league team to avoid them qualifying as a Super 2. Once a player has made it through the pre-arbitration years, they made it through the arbitration years, they've now qualified for the big-time contracts of free agency. So what players qualify? These are players with 6 or more years of service time. Any player who's released for any reason before 6 years, the player still needs to follow the salary arbitration process. So if they are released or non-tendered a contract through arbitration after year 3, they find a new home with a new team, they still have to go through those years of arbitration before they hit the 6 years of full-time free agency. MLB contracts are fully guaranteed. So if you hear a free agent contract of 4 years for $100 million, that is a guaranteed Major League Baseball contract. It's not like the NFL. You hear 4 years at $100 million in an NFL contract, you'll often hear after guaranteed $40 million or whatever the case may be. That is not true in Major League Baseball. They are fully guaranteed. Players can also negotiate opt-outs, where if they sign a 5-year deal, they can opt out after 2 or 3 or whatever is agreed upon. And they can also have no trade incentives, where a team cannot trade a player without their consent. Any player with 10 years of service time and the last 5 years of service time with their current team automatically receives no trade protection. Those are called 10 and 5 rights. Any player 10 and 5 rights, then if they're going to be traded, they have to consent to any trade to the team, so they control their own destiny as to where they're going to end up. MLB teams will pay a luxury tax penalty when their payroll exceeds $230 million. That level is actually going to go up over the next few years. It's not huge jumps, but it is small increments going up. There is no current minimum team payroll at this time in the major leagues. So right now in the major leagues, there are teams that are going to exceed the luxury tax, and there's teams that are going to have a payroll of approximately $40 million. So there is a huge gap between team payrolls in the majors right now, and that's a huge source of contention, especially on the lower end, because MLB teams have revenue sharing, and the lower end teams are really making money off of revenue sharing from higher teams. If you want me to get into that, comment down below. I'll talk about that in a different video. But for now, let's keep it moving in terms of free agency. Up next, we're going to take a look at 2 different players and what their contracts are going to look like over the course of the career. One is a younger player who's just getting into the system, and we'll explain what the team is doing as we move through what their thinking is here. And the other one is a player who's gone through all these different points along the way, made small amounts of money in his first few years, and what that can accumulate to in later years. So let's jump into the first one, in Brian Hayes of the Pittsburgh Pirates. Hayes was the 32nd overall pick in the 2015 draft. At that time, he signed a $1.855 million signing bonus. That was the recommended signing bonus for that slot in that season. Hayes has a current service time of 1.075 years, so technically he's following into the pre-arbitration parts of his contract, But as we'll see, something that's becoming more common in Major League Baseball is that younger players are signing longer term deals, and this essentially buys out their pre-arbitration and arbitration years as well as some free agent years. So we'll talk about what that's happening in terms for Ke'Bryan Hayes and what it means to his team in the Pittsburgh Pirates. So in 2015, we see the signing bonus there that Ke'Bryan Hayes signed with for his draft year. In 2020, the $84,000 that he earned. Ke'Bryan Hayes was only part of the Pittsburgh Pirates Major League roster that year for the month of September, so that's his value from that contract. In 2021 was his first full year in the major leagues in terms of pre-arbitration contract, where he made nearly $600,000 that season. Before the 2022 season, Hayes signed an 8-year, $70 million contract with a club option for a 9th year with the Pirates. So what that effectively does for the Pirates is it buys up the last 2 years of pre-arbitration as well as the first 3 years of arbitration deals for Ke'Bryan Hayes. Now, at those years, obviously the Pirates are overpaying what Hayes would naturally make during those years. The pre-arbitration contracts would have been much lower than the $10 million next 2 years that Hayes would have been making by a lot. Obviously, you see the difference between $600,000 for a pre-arbitration contract for him. But what they're doing is they're essentially buying up years of free agency. They're locking Hayes up to a longer-term deal where they buy out his arbitration years, which were probably a good value for player and team there, and they're buying up years of free agency. So the Pirates are banking on Hayes to become a long-term player for their team. They're getting cost certainty from the player, and their expectations then are that his free agency years are being bought out at a value that the Pirates expect will be vastly under what Hayes would normally be paid. It creates cost certainty for the team, and as a player, what it does is the player is going to be making more money early in their career. They're banking on this idea that they have this extended deal and they're making good money. So this is a type of contract we're seeing more and more in Major League Baseball, where teams are paying young talent that they are banking on for the future. They're paying them the money up front with some certainty on the other end, where they're going to receive a cheaper deal and get a bargain if that player hits their projections later in the career. They buy out their years of free agency and create some long-term stability for both player and team with cost certainty. Tampa Bay Rays have done this with Wander Franco. In a sense, the Padres did it to a lesser degree with Fernando Tatis. We've seen the Braves do it with Ronald Acuna Jr. This is a very smart type of deal, especially for smaller market teams. Pirates are a small market team who've now locked in third baseman Ke'Bryan Hayes for a guaranteed 7, 8, 9 years at a very cheap deal if Hayes produces. As a player in Hayes' perspective, he's banking on the fact that he is going to do well, but what it does for him is insurance against injury or poor performance. He is going to make his money in Major League Baseball should anything happen along the way. There's pros and cons to both team and player, but it's a very interesting situation we're seeing going on with these types of contracts. So now let's take a look at a player who went through the whole system all the way through in Blue Jays outfielder Kevin Pillar. Pillar went through a much different system than Ke'Bryan Hayes. Hayes is a highly regarded prospect. We take a look here. Kevin Pillar was drafted in the 32nd round in 2011. His signing bonus was $1,000. That round doesn't even exist anymore, and that low of a signing bonus, in fact, barely exists. His current service time in the Major League Baseball at this time is 7.113 years. We start to break down his contract years. We see the $1,000 signing bonus. He made it to the Blue Jays in 2013, made $125,000 on pre-arbitration time. That's not a full season, but it was part of a season. 2014, he accumulated more service time again, making $174,000. Again, part of a pre-arbitration year. We start to see more service time in 2015, 2016, and 2017, where eventually he surpassed the 3 years of service time. So all those years were pre-arbitration contracts, making approximately $500,000 to $550,000 per year. We see the jump to 2018, and that's when Pilar hits his first year of arbitration. His award that year was $3.25 million on his first year of arbitration. He opened 2019 just briefly with the Blue Jays, who paid him $155,000, but he was traded to the Giants early that season. So you combine it all, it's about $5.8 million in 2019. That was Pilar's second year of arbitration rights. After 2019, the Giants declined to tender the third-year arbitration contract to Kevin Pilar. That award was going to be approximately $9.7 to $10 million. The Giants decided at that point in time to let Pilar leave. He signed on with the Boston Red Sox, and in 2020 he was also traded to the Colorado Rockies. So his final arbitration year came in with between the Red Sox and the Rockies at approximately $1.5 to $1.6 million in that range of his final arbitration deal. Prior to the 2021 Major League Baseball season, Kevin Pilar signed a 2-year free agent contract with the New York Mets. He'd finally hit his 6 years of service time and was eligible for full free agency. In signing that deal, he played the 2021 season with the Mets, making $3.6 million. Pilar and the Mets could not reach an agreement for that second year, and then the Mets declined the option year on the second part of Pilar's contract. That buyout cost the Mets $1.4 million that was written into the contract. So there we can see Kevin Pilar going through the entire process from his years of pre-arbitration with the Blue Jays, his first full year of arbitration with the Blue Jays, the second one primarily with the Giants, a third one in the shortened form of the 2020 season paid between the Red Sox and Rockies. He finally hits free agency and signs with the Mets. He has a 2-year deal with an option for the second year. He's paid for the first year. The Mets declined the option for the second, and he has a guaranteed buyout for that part of the contract as well. So there you get a sense of Kevin Pilar going through all the years of pre-arbitration, arbitration, and finally free agency. Pilar is currently on a minor league deal with the Los Angeles Dodgers, so we'll see if he can make it back into the major leagues. But he's a player considering a 32nd round draft pick to accumulate 7 years of service time has to be a huge win for him as a player, both in terms of quality of life and financial freedom. Thank you for making it all the way to the end of the video. I greatly appreciate all the support that you've been showing to this channel. If you're interested in more of this type of content, make sure you comment down below. Ask me a question about baseball. Let's see if I can make a video on it. As always, if you're interested in learning more and more, make sure you hit that thumbs up button that tells me you're loving the content, as well as subscribe to the channel so you know when new videos are being posted. You can expect new content as often as possible. Make sure you check out our Fantasy Baseball Update show, which will be coming out later this month or potentially into early June. You will not want to miss that. It's one of the biggest views on the channel so far. So until next time, everyone, take care.